I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Nisha Modi. She's a feminist healing coach and librarian at Nisha Creative. And today her talk is titled Moving from What's Wrong with You to What Happened to You, Trauma-Informed Care in Libraries. And with that, I'll hand it off to Nisha. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina, and hello, everyone. I'm so happy to be here and share this topic with you that I'm very passionate about, and I'm loving talking to different libraries, academic and non-academic ones about as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. So yes, moving from what's wrong with you to what happened to you, trauma-informed care in libraries. So as a land acknowledgement, I wanted to say that I live on a land once known as Tovangar. It was the home of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples, who were the stewards of this land before it was settled. Tovangar was occupied and colonized by Spain in the 1700s and then by Mexico in the 1800s. Then in 1846, the United States declared war on Mexico in order to take possession of the Los Angeles region, California, and other lands in the West. I live in the city of Los Angeles that continues to evolve within the structures of capitalism, and I'll always have more to connect with and learn about this land. And just in terms of my background, my name is Nisha Modi. My pronouns are she, her. I identify as a South Asian American woman who's a daughter of immigrants. I'm divorced, I'm able-bodied, cisgender, and heterosexual. My positionality represents a lot of who I am, but not everything about me. And I came into this work after I started my own healing journey. I've always been interested in psychology and self-improvement, but it took my divorce and the death of my father within a year of each other for me to take a deep look at my own trauma history and how it affected the way that I am, and also how this spilled over into professional settings. So this eventually led to me understanding that self-care needs to also include community care and that we have to consider systemic oppression in our work. So I was able to kind of take my background and the things that have happened in my own life and apply it to ways we can also apply this in libraries and also just as human beings. So today I'm going to talk about two main topics. One, what is trauma in the first place? Because I think that's important to consider before talking about what trauma-informed care is, and then talking about trauma-informed care and how it could potentially look in libraries. So I'll be providing some frameworks and a lot to think about and consider. So what is trauma? So the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration defines trauma as individual trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual is physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So this is a pretty comprehensive definition, and I bring this up because oftentimes some people define trauma as an actual event or the series of events, rather than that it's what results from it. So for example, if two people are in the same car accident, they've experienced the same traumatic event, but the trauma that they have can differ. One person can experience their trauma very differently than the other person, because we all are just different individual people and we process things in our bodies and our minds and emotions very differently. But it's also important to consider it from a systemic perspective. So this quote is taken from Resmaa Menakem's book called My Grandmother's Hands, Racialized Trauma and the Pathway to Mending Our Hearts and Bodies. This is an excellent book. I really recommend it. He talks about how trauma looks from a systemic level and inside ourselves as individuals. And he also says that trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It is a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Trauma is also not an event. Trauma is the body's protective response to an event or a series of events that it perceives as potentially dangerous. I think this is a really important thing to note because we think of trauma, I feel like it kind of goes in that negative category. And yes, it's not a positive feeling to experience, but it is what is actually literally protecting our bodies and keeping us safe so that we can survive as human beings. It might be maladaptive sometimes, and there's ways we can increase our awareness to make it more adaptive and to understand and have compassion for what's happened to us. But I do think this is a really important point to make. So kind of going with this, thinking about systemic trauma. So there's individual traumas, that can come upon in our lives. But I think it's really critical to understand that trauma is systemic. And I think that's something we have all seen with COVID as a collective trauma that we've all been experiencing, but on different levels, because we're having different experiences with our workplaces, with other people, with if we are parenting during the pandemic, if we have loved ones who may have died from COVID or who haven't. So we all have these different experiences. And so systemic trauma, like the definition of trauma said, it could be a series of events. It also can be things like racism, sexism, ableism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, fat phobia, the history of colonization and white supremacy. All of these are things that are insidious and have happened over time for very, very long. And all of these are very alive right now. And we can look at trauma through the lens of primary trauma, historical or intergenerational trauma, as well as secondary trauma. And I just want to give a content warning. The next slide has a mention of suicide. You're welcome to mute me for a moment if you just want to wait a minute for me to get through it. So I just wanted to let you all know that. So this illustration, I have everything in the references, talks about these three lenses. So the first on top, it says, when she is 13, Sharon loses her older brother to suicide. For Sharon, the sudden death of her brother is a primary trauma. Then it says, Sharon was born and raised on a reservation in Montana, where multiple generations were subjected to primary traumas, including displacement, starvation, violence, and poverty. So Sharon and her community may be experiencing the effects of historical and intergenerational trauma. And intergenerational trauma is something that is passed down through epigenetics. So not only is she dealing with the primary trauma in her own life with her brother, but also with what has happened to people within her family and lineage and community. And last, it says, as an adult, Sharon works as a grief counselor, specializing in patients who have lost loved ones to suicide. So you could see that Sharon's job puts her at risk for secondary trauma because she's dealing with this directly. So it's basically because of her brother's death, it can trigger, trauma responses in her because she's working with that. But I also want to mention vicarious trauma, which I didn't put here, but vicarious trauma is not necessarily secondary trauma. It could even be that Sharon is not a grief counselor specializing in patients who have lost loved ones to suicide, but what if she was a healthcare worker during COVID, just seeing people come in and out, seeing people died? That is still a vicarious trauma you're experiencing, seeing things. So I think that's something we've all probably seen with COVID specifically. And I do bring up COVID because it is still very, very present, and it is something we've experienced collectively. So I want to note that trauma affects our nervous system. And when I'm talking about our nervous system, I'm talking about the ways we regulate, the ways our body responds. And one example I often give that I think is portrayed a lot in the media is the example of veterans. So veterans who may have been in war and might be more, for example, very sensitive to loud noises. So maybe it's, Independence Day or the 4th of July, and they hear a firework and they are very activated and triggered and might, have some type of trauma response, whether that's isolating or externalizing it somehow. So basically what is happening is the nervous system is detecting it. Their body is detecting a potential, something that they have experienced in the past, and it's reacting similarly to their initial moment of that traumatic event. And that is what their trauma is, essentially, their trauma response. So this is the nervous system. It doesn't have eyes. It doesn't see that it's a firework. It doesn't see that you're not going to die or you're not in harm's way. And that's a kind of a macro example of, even things with racism or sexism or fat phobia. And what I had mentioned earlier, systemically, when you keep experiencing microaggressions or aggressions or disenfranchisement and oppression, it affects your nervous system and you could shut down. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. And as Russ Momenicum said, our nervous systems want to keep us safe. And safety is the absence of threat and the presence of connection. So I'll say that again, that safety is the absence of threat and the presence of connection. And when I'm talking about threat, I'm also talking about what our body is perceiving as a threat, similar to the example that I mentioned. So if our body thinks that something, there is a harm or something that can hurt us, it's going to react in a certain way. And the presence of connection is connecting to a situation, connecting with someone who is a safe person, et cetera. And I think this itself, and I'm going to talk about safety a little bit more, is something really to consider in our work environments in libraries. Safety we feel with work colleagues, safety we feel with supervisors, safety we feel with patrons, et cetera, and how we all are experiencing that safety very differently and perceiving it very differently. And that doesn't mean anything's wrong with us, which is what I'll talk about soon, but it means that things have happened to us in our lives, and it's important to have that awareness and see what we can do for moving that awareness into action. And I also wanted to add that library work, and I just kind of said this, that library workers and patrons have a variety of histories that most of us don't know about, which directly affects theirs, yours, and my own nervous system. So someone might seem okay to you, but they're not. They're probably trying to cope. And think of how much we've had to cope and not directly deal with COVID because we have to get to work, we have to do stuff. Our body's trying to keep us going and survive, but in doing that, sometimes we don't allow our nervous system response to complete. We just kind of keep going, and all of that gets stored inside of our bodies, literally. So here are some examples of trauma responses. Basically, this is kind of an arbitrary visualization I have here, but what I showed this visualization to show how layered and intersected these can be. Some of these are intentional, like isolations out in this little like island over here, but these are the different things that can happen. Some of these look completely opposite, but this is how they can look. So it can look like isolation, overworking, having disruptive sleep, projecting onto others, people pleasing, so saying yes when you actually mean no. It can look like crying, reactive verbal or nonverbal language, complacency, anger, dissociating completely, and not thinking that you have needs because they've never been met. If you in your life have your needs inconsistently met or not met much, you stop feeling like you have any, and that is itself a trauma response. So I just invite you to contemplate how these might look for you and how these might look for people that you work with and patrons as well. So next, what is trauma-informed care in libraries? Whoops, sorry. And what is it? How does it look in libraries? So to put it simply, trauma-informed care asks as a concept, what happened to you instead of what's wrong with you. And I actually think there's like a book now on like Oprah's book list called What Happened to You that I personally haven't read. It's on my list, but I heard it's really, really amazing. So it adds that complexity and that nuance and that depth to something may have happened to you as opposed to what's wrong with this person, which is a question I myself have asked plenty of times, you know, when I'm frustrated, like what's wrong with that person, you know, but all of us just have these experiences, and it's sometimes we don't have the capacity to have that depth of understanding. But if we do kind of start with, is that person okay, as opposed to we need to quote unquote fix this quote unquote problem, those are two very different thoughts that can lead to different outcomes, right? Lead to different actions that you take. And I wanted to add that most literature on this topic, though it is expanding and being trauma-informed is kind of a new buzzword, most literature and research is in the social work and psychology disciplines. We're asking this question more directly to someone is more acceptable. Like if you're a therapist, for example, saying what happened to you might be acceptable, and it's not as appropriate for us to maybe do that in the library setting. But I think the point of this is not so much of asking what happened to you, but more maybe thinking something did and just assuming that things are happening in people's lives because they are, right? So just thinking, how would I approach this by knowing that I don't know what's happening, not assuming things and maybe not asking, maybe not stating something directly, but asking an open-ended question. That's just one example. And I wanted to provide this roadmap to just show that it is a long road to be trauma-informed. This is from Trauma-Informed Oregon. They have a really great website and really great videos if you are ever interested in learning more about trauma-informed care. But it shows, and it actually breaks this down from an organizational perspective, each step for each phase. But I just wanted to show this. And it's also something that you can contemplate for the organization you're in, the department you're in, the individual group you're in, depending on the type of organization you're a part of, where they are, where you are on this map, and knowing that those different states, it takes a long time. So the first phase is just being trauma aware, which is why I started this presentation with what is trauma, right? And then that moves into becoming more trauma sensitive, having more knowledge and whatnot about it. And then that goes to being trauma responsive, actually responding to things, having the awareness and the sensitivity, and then trauma informed. And then as you can see, there's an assessment. And, I think this isn't necessarily linear. It can be very iterative and different, but the purpose of me sharing this is to show how complex it can be and how long it can take, and how I think it's so important for us to just really begin with that self-reflection and awareness. So these are the 4 R's that are assumptions about trauma-informed care that basically say that if there's a trauma-informed approach, it will, 1, realize the widespread impact of trauma in the first place. 2, recognize the signs and symptoms of trauma in others. So this is, as students come back to school, seeing how that can look, knowing, that they might be experiencing things even though it might not be visible. 3, respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policy, procedures, and practices. And then lastly, resisting re-traumatization actively. So doing whatever you can so that individual or group or whoever is not re-traumatized and that cycle and those patterns continue. I really like this graphic. I'm glad this is being recorded because I'm not going to go through every one, but it kind of shows not trauma-informed to trauma-informed care. So on top, it says power over for not trauma-informed, then it goes to power with. It has judging and not trauma-informed, observing. You're crazy to it makes sense, even that where the word crazy is very ableist. Saying us and them versus we're all in this together, we're all interdependent. I'm here to fix you versus I'm here to support your healing. The goal is to do things the quote unquote right way, and the trauma informed way is choice, which I'll talk about in a second too. Saying that there is one right way is also a characteristic of white supremacy culture, talked about by Tema Okun. And, so this is just a really helpful graphic, I think, and I have it cited also at the end here to just start that mentality of what happened to you versus what's wrong with you. So the 6 principles of a trauma-informed approach, also developed by SAMHSA, are 1, safety. So the safety, as I said, is the absence of threat and the presence of connection. That's physical, emotional, and psychological safety. Next is trustworthiness and transparency. So building and maintaining trust and not holding back information that affects others on a personal or organizational level. That continues to foster safety and doesn't catch anyone by surprise. Essentially, not being transparent implies a lack of trust and care. Next, peer support, knowing that individualism is also a characteristic of white supremacy culture. How are we getting support from others, especially peers who have similar experiences? How are we seeing that if we're in the academic setting for students, how are they getting that? How can libraries partner with that? And this is, I think, really important, especially if there's a lack of mental health support. Then there's collaboration and mutuality, working together, thinking of ways to share power and decision-making, thinking about how this looks at the leadership level. Also helps you recognize how everyone has a role to play with the trauma-informed approach and how relationships and systems are interdependent. Next is empowerment, voice, and choice. So this is empowering others so that they can feel that they can use their voice and have actual choices and not the illusion of choices. It also recognizes that we're all unique beings with different types of voices to share, as well as different ways that we prefer to communicate. And it's really important, though, to still consider power in this. So, for example, some people might not have the space to speak up, maybe in a meeting or something like that, because more dominating individuals take over based on their identity or hierarchy. But it's also true that others might need time to process or prefer to not speak up as much in larger groups. And I think this is where it's really important to discern what's happening. And I think this is a responsibility that leaders have in order to understand people on their team and what they prefer, because that itself is empowerment, not forcing people to speak up if they don't want to, and knowing that we're all at different places in our lives where we feel how comfortable we feel doing that. And lastly is cultural, historical, and gender issues. So looking at things systemically. And I like to say, just from my perspective, that safety and cultural, historical, and gender issues to me are umbrellas of this whole approach, providing safety and understanding the systemic issues that take place. And this also includes ability, which is not included necessarily here, though that is cultural and historical too. Thinking about language that might be ableist and how intersectionality plays into it. So I'm going to go into each of these and talk about how they can look in libraries. So first is safety. So thinking about where you might feel threats in library spaces, where patrons might feel threats. And again, this is the perceived threat. And I know we're not going to know everything, but just having multiple people thinking about this, and especially people who may have a disability, getting feedback from lots of people with different identities can really point out a lot of areas to be more trauma informed. Thinking about what other resources can be used besides security and policing. Who do you feel safe with and who do you not feel safe with? Just having an awareness of that and knowing then how much you want to involve yourself with this specific person and how much you care to give, or if you're going to volunteer on that committee or not. Because I think being trauma informed starts with being a trauma informed human, as I mentioned, and doing that with colleagues as well before even thinking about patrons. And letting, but in reference interactions, you can let people know what to expect. And while you teach, you can give materials ahead of time, checking for understanding. Safety is also like not catching people by surprise as well. So trustworthiness and transparency in libraries. Some questions you can ask are, how are decisions made at the highest level and how is it communicated? And also, is transparency a way to avoid liability or because of actual care? And how is this policy communicated? Thinking about meta communication, communicating about the communication itself, offering different choices, and talking about pros, cons, and accessibility. And thinking about how hierarchy might foster trust and mistrust and what practices can mitigate this. Peer support in libraries can look like connecting with outside partners, other departments, et cetera, seeing how they can be supportive, understanding what they're doing to help students. And also what peer support library workers can have in itself. What peer support students have, what's the library's role in this? And also just something simply, how are we checking in with each other, especially now as people are back to work? Just asking, how are you doing? Like, how does it feel now working back here? What's your preference? And I don't think there has to be an inciting of event to check in on each other. I mean, especially since COVID have started, have made it a practice to just text my friends, be like, hey, just checking in. And they will end up telling me things that I would never have known had I not done that. And also animal support is also peer support. So I definitely encourage that. Collaboration and mutuality in libraries. Thinking about our project shared and how is credit given. And I want to add in POC or WOC plus LIB, I was the co-author on about appropriating people of color, their intellectual property and their work. So how are we giving that credit? How do leaders talk about collaboration themselves? How do we celebrate everyone's strength? And back to how do leaders talk about collaboration? Also, what does reviews, peer review, et cetera, look like? And how is that collaborative versus competitive? And just basically that everyone has a role. How are people's accomplishments being measured based on their unique strengths versus standards? Empowerment, voice, and choice in libraries. So if things get tense, whether it's at the circulation desk or in a meeting, like thinking about what choices someone has, because oftentimes when our nervous systems are activated, we think we have no choices, that something's just coming at us and we have to escape. But it might be helpful to say, okay, these are the 3 things we can do. How are we feeling about that? Give yourself permission to step away from work, feel empowered that you have that choice, that you can do that. I know and I'm really hoping that you do. If not, I think that's something really to consider for yourself about how that itself is re-traumatizing. As a leader, being very clear about how your team can care for themselves and each other, and checking in as well. And like I said, maybe not everyone likes to speak up in certain contexts. So getting to know people's communication preferences, because this makes people feel seen and heard, which is, as human beings, what we all want is to feel seen and heard. Considering difference rather than making everything equal. Sometimes equality and even equity is more about liability, in my opinion, than actual human needs. So let's look at these differences and have that nuance. And then cultural, historical, and gender issues in libraries. So, whoops. So responding to Indigenous erasure beyond land acknowledgements, how are things looking for land back? Looking at knowledge organization itself and how that has a history of colonization. Moving beyond the diversity statement and performative allyship, what about like hiring data, pay scales, accountability, especially? How is that looking? And remote work, which is, I think, really important, as that's still, you know, now people are going back to work, but you know, people with disabilities have forever had a lot of solution, had to deal with work from home, or like had to come up with creative solutions, you know, and that was so centered that there was that practice, you know, as COVID started. And now I feel like people are kind of just returning back to work, and all of a sudden those access needs are almost being disregarded. And this is just something I've personally seen, like, you know, whether it's on social media or talking to people I know. So how does remote work center that and those different nuances and those differences, and consider mental health and also different family structures that might not be in the nuclear family? People have generational multi-generation family structures. They might be caring for someone, et cetera. And also, we're in a service profession, and how is that tied to gender and race? How much do we overwork ourselves, quote unquote, in service to others, right? And I think this is really, really important to mention, because burnout, I think, can be very real in libraries. And how is that, one, a trauma response? And how are we saying, like, kind of attributing that to like, oh, well, that's what I have to do. And also, how is that gendered and racialized, as it often is? And of course, I think it's really important to compensate BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and people of color for their EDI work, if they're on committees, et cetera. How are they being compensated and recognized doing additional work on top of their already existing duties? So yeah, that's I just made it with a few minutes left for questions. These are my references. So thank you so much for being here. I kind of wanted to get through everything, so I apologize if I spoke too fast. But these are just the nuts and bolts, right? There's so much more to this, but yeah, I'd be happy to answer questions at this time.
Hi, Nisha. Thank you so much for that presentation. There's so much to unpack there.
Yeah.
I have received some questions, and we probably have time for maybe one. Along with trauma-informed librarianship, I like to bring up trauma-informed design or workspaces. I haven't seen anything on this yet, but some of what Nisha has mentioned ties in with how we can help design library spaces to reduce trauma.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. Thank you so much, Patricia. I think it's really important to consider that, especially for when we're looking at accessibility, as well as like bathrooms, for example. Like, how are we responding with gender neutral bathrooms, and thinking about what people want in terms of their sensory needs. If we're looking at autistic folks, like, what do they need? Quiet spaces, not so quiet spaces, thinking about, and are we having the quiet space next to the not quiet space, you know? And I think this is where it's really important to get feedback from the community and understand what those needs are, because that can be different across different communities, across different campuses. And I think this is another space to partner with other areas, especially if you are in an academic library, with other departments that might have more of this expertise, understanding what needs there might be. I think this is an accessibility need, not just for disabilities, but it can include all different types of identities and types of needs that you have. So this is not something I have expertise on, but I definitely think it's important, especially because of sensory needs, and to just create a more inviting space for people and to gather that feedback as well.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question.
Yeah.
So what has been the response when you've led a course on trauma-informed library practice with a team at the same institution? What does that look like?
Leading that with the team of the same institution?
Yes.
Yeah, so I've done that once, and it was definitely, it can be challenging because sometimes people might not want to speak up and talk about things. And I did have one experience with this, and I felt like overall it went well, but I think something in the future that I personally would do is meet with people individually to talk to them and gather that feedback and integrate it. I really think it's important in this case to have that buy-in from the top of the leadership level, so that they understand that how important this is, and that people can, they know, first of all, library workers know that leadership cares about this in the first place, and that it's not about finding that answer. And I think that's one thing I want to mention. This is not about finding the answers, it's trying things out, because there will be something that you do something that helps someone not feel re-traumatized that might re-traumatize someone else. This is not a perfect answer, which I think is really hard for us, but I do think it's important to try things out and gather that feedback and have that transparency and care in that communication to show that we're trying to see how this works. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was fantastic. We all need this content. I really appreciate your time and your presentation. We're going to transition to our poster, but again, thank you, Nisha.